You know, all peoples have their own hero. For example, Americans have Georgie Boy, the Scots have William Wallace, and Indians have Gandhi. But we Frisians, we have Pier Gerlofs Donia. And he had a big fucking sword. If you came from the last video about the Frisian freedom, or just hate having context, you can skip to the next part of the video. We find ourselves in Friesland, in the 15th century. The Frisians are enjoying a system of governance known as the Frisian freedom. This meant that there was no central government, feudalism, serfdom, or a count. This absence of a central authority eventually led to a split in Frisian society between vetkepers and schieringers. This split often amounted to violence and sometimes even wars. In 1498, the Emperor Maximilian I appointed Albert of Saxony as the ruler of Friesland. But East Friesland had its own rising star, Edzard Sirksena. During the period of the Frisian freedom, several noble families in East Frisia had tried to become the sole ruler in the east, and the Sirksenas had came out on top in 1497. Edzard accepted Albert's rule as his feudal lord. In 1500, Albert died and his son, George the Bearded of Saxony, inherited Albert's titles. And what a beard it was! Humana, humana. In 1506, Edzard was named ruler of Groningen by the city's council, but he was also looking respectfully at the rest of Friesland. But in 1514, the emperor changed Beardy Boy's title to Stadtholder of Friesland. That was unacceptable to Groningen, and Edzard named himself the defender of the city. This started the conflict known as the Saxon Feud. There are a lot of things wrong with people's perception of Grutte Pier. And before we get into the real meat of the video, it's important that we discuss a few things. He is a figure that is kind of close to many Frisians. Or at least, as close as any historical figure can get. But this has led to much mythologizing about his life. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't want to pull down his statue or anything. Nor do I want to take away his story from anyone. But I do think there should be more attention for his actual life and less for his myth, as his actual story is far more interesting in my opinion. See, the problem with Grutte Pier is that his actions as a person has had little influence on Frisian history. However, as a historical figure and symbol, his influence on Frisian culture has been pretty big. Now, let's get some misconceptions out of the way real quick. Grutte Pier did not fight at the Battle of Wines, did not serve King Redbot, and was certainly not a Frisi. These things and people were far before his time. But also the common perception of Grutte Pier, being a revolutionary, is wrong as well and speaks to the volume his story has been bent by popular perception and mythologizing. But that is what I like about Grutte Pier. He was no great and perfect hero, he was just a big dude, plain and simple. He was a man with his up and downsides, which I find much more interesting than just a black and white story of a freedom fighter versus an evil tyrant. So, without further ado, let's jump into the story of Grutte Pier. It is in the hectic period of the Vetkeper and Schieringer conflicts that a man named Pier Gerlofs Donia was born. He was born around 1480 in the town of Kimswerd near Haas. His parents were called Gerlofs Pier and Vokal Sibrands Bonga. His mother Vokal was a descendant of a Schieringer noble family. This noble-ish ancestry is the first thing that Pier and William Wallace share. Both are commonly thought of as commoners, but both were at least related to nobility. This leads me to an interesting point. There are some comparisons to be made between Grutte Pier and William Wallace. Both have suffered from inaccurate depictions. Both use pretty big swords, and both are seen as great freedom fighters, which is not 100% accurate in both cases. And a few more comparisons. Now, there is no direct link between Pier and Wallace, as they lived 200 years and one North Sea apart from each other. But I thought it would be an interesting way to take a look at both. Also, this gives me a video title that is a bit more appealing to a foreign audience. Wink. Grutte Pier was married and had 2 children. He lived on a farm near his birthplace. Pier was famed for his size, some sources putting him over 2 meters. You can see this in his nickname, Grutte Pier, or Great Pier. Some myths even claim he could lift a horse of roughly 492 kilos. Now, this is of course an exaggeration. But he was truly strong. A sword that is currently in the Fries Museum in Leeuwarden is said to have been his sword. The blade is over 2 meters and weighs 6.6 kilos. But then again, this is unlikely, as this sword was probably a ceremonial sword, because it would have been way too heavy to wield effectively, even for a strong boy such as Pier. However, for the coolness factor, I'm gonna let him use the sword in the video. George of Saxony had recently brought in a mercenary army called the Black Army to Friesland. He used his army to fight against Edzard and to suppress the conflict between Schieringers and Vetkepers. They often participated in raids and plundered several towns. On the 29th of January 1515, they went on one of their raids and burned down some farms around Kooistra. One of these farms, however, belonged to Grutte Pier. His wife, and possibly his children, perished during this raid. Grutte Pier's life as farmer abruptly ended, and his quest for revenge had started. He gathered a band of peasants and disgruntled noblemen and formed a small army. They named themselves the Black Band of Arem, or in Frisian, the Aremers Zwarte Heep. This name was a taunt against the Black Army, responsible for his loss. Now, as we discussed in the video about the Frisian freedom, resolving feuds with violence was common practice in Friesland, so in his eyes, he was acting within his rights. But regardless of legality, by seeking revenge against the Black Army, he also antagonized the Saxons, and was sucked into the conflict known as the Saxon Feud is the first in a string of conflicts known as the Gelders Wars. The Saxon Feud was sort of a proxy war within a proxy war. As the Saxons stood against the Frisians, the Saxons were backed by the Burgundian Netherlands, and the Frisians by the Count of Gelders. But those two were backed by even bigger players. The Count of Gelders was aligned with the French king, and the Burgundian Netherlands had fallen in the possession of the Habsburgs, and were therefore backed by the Holy Roman Emperor. These wars were part of a big struggle between Valois and Habsburg dynasties, as they were trying to achieve the universal monarchy. Pier was dragged into this conflict, fighting to remove the Saxon influence, and thus his quest for justice turns into a battle for independence, Braveheart style. Though historians are still unsure if he truly believed in his cause, or if a return to the Frisian freedom was his way of getting his vengeance. But in my humble opinion, I think it started as a means to an end, but the longer he fought, the more he started to believe in his cause. Escalation of commitment style. Oh, and Edzard was just in it for his own ambitions. Opportunism style. The Saxon feud began when Edzard declared himself the defender of Groningen against George the Facial-Haired. The emperor declared Edzard an outlaw. A large number of Frisians turned against George, and only the cities of Haas, Friesland and Leeuwarden remained loyal to him. However, George was supported by a coalition of 24 German rulers, together with the Black Army he hired. They forced Edzard into a two-front war in 1514 and quickly took chunks out of his territory. This severely weakened his position. The Frisians were now looking elsewhere for aid, as Edzard could not defend them on his own. Charles of Egmont, the Count of Gelders, said that he was willing to defend the Frisian freedom against the Saxons. In 1515, things were looking up for Edzard again, as he reconquered two of his last strongholds. But sadly, in May of that year, George and his magnificent beard leaves our tale. He sold his titles in Friesland to Charles of Habsburg, who had quite the chin and would later on become the King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor. Thus the war changed from Saxons versus Gelders to Habsburgs versus Gelders. It might be a bit confusing about which Charles I speak of, as both sides are led by one. So keep in mind that when I make a chin joke, I'm talking about Charles of Habsburg. If not, I'm talking about Charles of Gelders. Old chin boy Charles Habsburg appointed Floris of Egmont to be the stadholder of Friesland. Floris, by the way, was Charles of Gelders' second cousin. In 1517, Floris of Egmont attempted to besiege Snitz, but Grutte Pier, who was staying there, managed to keep the city from surrendering. Later, Grutte Pier swiftly took Hilpen, despite it being recently reinforced by Habsburg soldiers. That year, Pier took to the sea, and started pirating in the Zuiderzee. Pier had a big hatred of Hollanders, as the Zuiderzee is where he is said to have uttered his famous, or infamous, shibboleth. Boter, bree en green cheese, wat dat net zeggen is geen opjochte Fries. Or translated, butter, rye bread and green cheese, who can't say this is no true Frisian. If his captives could not reproduce the sentence without an accent, they were not Frisian and, well, let's just take a look.
Boter, brie en green cheese?
This sentence is still used endlessly to teach our non-Frisian friends whom often can't say this without making mistakes. The Black Band of Arem had grown to roughly 5,000 men and had become financially dependent on Charles of Gelders. The Black Band also started to include many mercenaries from Gelders. Emboldened by these numbers, Grutte Pier set his sights on the coast of Holland. In June of 1517, Grutte Pier struck at Medemblik. Pier took the town itself with ease, but a large part of the inhabitants had fled to the local castle, which, by the way, was built by Florence V of the previous video. The Black Band of Arem failed to take the castle and retreated. On their way out though, they did destroy two castles in Alkmaar, Nieuwburg and Middelburg. Unfortunately for the Frisians, the Crimson Chin managed to get East Frisia out of the war by lifting Edzard's outlaw status in 1517, and Edzard was forced to cede some territories, and to abandon his ambitions west of the Eems. Officially, the Saxon Feud ended here, but Pier and Charles kept on fighting their own battles. In 1519, Pier managed to defeat a fleet of the Habsburgers and seized 11 ships. At this point though, Pier had become a ruthless pirate, as he was also attacking neutral ships, which his allies did not really appreciate. Then again, as the turn of the 18th century taught us, hiring pirates in your wars often does not turn out great. However, something even worse than Edzard selling out happened. It became apparent that Charles of Gelders had deceived the Frisians. He had no intention of defending the Frisian freedom. Instead, he was looking to take Friesland for himself. This was a blow to Grutte Pier's morale that he couldn't take. And in 1519, after a string of setbacks and a stalemate in the conflict, he retired and moved to Snits, the city he once stubbornly defended. He died 1 year later, on the 28th of October, 1520. He was buried beneath the Grote Kerk in Snits. His former lieutenant, Wiert Jelkema, who was said to have rivaled Pier's size and strength, took over the Black Band and continued his fight for 3 years, until he was decisively defeated and beheaded in Leeuwarden in 1523. This was the end of the Aremers van de Heep. That concludes the life of Grutte Pier. Like I said, his personal impact on Frisian history was minimal at best. Things might have been different if Sirksna or Pier were successful, but as it stands, Grutte Pier only managed to delay the inevitable. However, his tale is one of bitter loss, bloodthirsty revenge and betrayal. A mix that is guaranteed to give you a tragedy worth remembering. You might see him as a sort of anti-hero in a way. He lost everything, and in response he dedicated his life to fighting those who took his old life away from him. But at the same time, he was a brutal and often cruel pirate. See, that's the funny thing about historical figures. We have a tendency to see them as either good or bad, but often they're a mix of both, with positive and negative sides. Just like Grutte Pier, they were all just humans. If there is any interest in me making a video about William Wallace, or better known as the Grutte Pier of Scotland, let me know. But in the meantime, please be a true freedom fighter and leave a like, comment and press the subscribe button. And click the bell icon to get notified when the next video is uploaded. And have a good one. See you all next time.